Huge honor to be here today. I mean, I feel I fall a long way short of Lucy Chappell's giants because, my work is, as Philippa says, about engaging big audiences with science and medicine rather than doing research. And of course, when I talk about engaging the public, or when we like to talk about engaging the public, we've always got to remember that the public's a really heterogeneous mass of lots of different audiences. And, you'd engage children in quite a different way from adults. And I came into science engagement by quite a circuitous route. I started doing research bouncing neutrons off ultra thin films and soap bubbles made with heavy soap. I worked on the student newspaper to keep busy, and when my results were rather thin on the ground. And I ended up going into journalism as a career because of Margaret Thatcher and Chernobyl. The former because employment prospects were a bit bleak in the research base at the time, and I was encouraged by my supervisor to go into journalism, and he kindly offered me a postdoc as a kind of safety net if it didn't work out. And then working for a nuclear magazine, I think I was probably the first British journalist to hear about Chernobyl because all the alarms went off as I tried to go into the Forsmark nuclear plant in Sweden with some Scandinavian journalists. And that was really the first the Western world knew about the fallout of the world's worst nuclear accident. And that was the global news story of 1986. And the Daily Telegraph, keen to keep abreast of all things nuclear, hired me. And that really got me into dealing with huge audiences. So next slide. So I got into the Telegraph and worked there until 2008. And it gave me a sort of amazing perspective on lots of different science. So and really the constant drumbeat through the whole thing was climate change. I covered Jim Hanson's Senate evidence that drew attention to global warming in '88. And it just remained a constant throughout until I left the newspaper, including things like the quest for fusion power, which is always 50 years off, as the old joke goes. There was also the emerging link between climate change and extreme weather. I came across some very promising wordsmiths, such as this tussle-haired young chap who used to work with me. I can't remember his name, but I do hope he's thriving. And when I left in 2008, it was obvious that ecosystem destruction and climate change demanded immediate action. And I have to say, it is slightly baffling to me as we approach COP26 in Glasgow, that we're still talking about it when it was obvious something urgent had to be done back at a big climate meeting. It must have been COP-3 or something in Toronto in '88. And I think what was interesting about doing this job is it gave me a panoramic view of biomedical science as well. So the cloning of Dolly was a really big story, and I ended up writing a book with Ian Wilmot. The race for the human genome was a massive story, supposedly completed in 2000. And I find it interesting that it's only really a couple of days ago that the telomere to telomere consortium actually finished the job. Then I've also covered the very first gene therapy trials, the rise of gene therapy, the fall of gene therapy, and then the rise of gene therapy again, the rise and fall, at least in public perception, of genetic modification. And perhaps for me, the biggest health scare before COVID-19 was when the first link was established between BSE and CJD. There were lots of things I did to engage with more specialist audiences at the time. So I organized the Scientists Meet the Media Party, which we still run with these Royal Societies. It's almost going for 30 years. Science writing and photography competitions. It's great to see former winners like Ed Yong become Pulitzer Prize winners, Science Page and supplements, and also did lots of mass experiments with the BBC called LiveLab and Megalab. Now, I continued with citizen science when I became the editor of New Scientist, and this helped me make a little contribution to research. I became interested in online cognitive tests developed by Adrian Owen, who was then at the MRC Cognition and Brain Sciences unit. We adapted his online tests for mass experiments to encourage readers to give us some details about themselves and then try out a suite of 12 tests. And we launched it in this piece I wrote with Adrian in New Scientist. Now, when I had a go at the tests online, I was surprised at how long it took. It took a good half an hour to get through these tests. which actually got more and more difficult. And I have to admit, I was pretty worried that no one was going to take part. But we did make sure that we made it very hooky. We gave participants an assessment of how they did. We encouraged them to get their friends to have a go, and we promised to share the results. And I think this is really critical because, as I told a recent King's meeting, citizen science is as much about the citizens as the science itself. And it's really important to ask, what are the citizens going to get out of the experiment? Well, it turns out we need not have worried because more than 100,000 people around the world took part. And I think one of the reasons was we made it viral and because it felt authentic. And we ended up with good data on something like 45,000 people. We published the results in Neuron in 2012, and it challenged the idea that you could just boil down cognition to a single number, IQ. And backed up with some brain scanning studies, we found there are at least 3 distinct components to cognition: short-term memory, reasoning, and a verbal component. Now, I have to say the IQ community hated the study with a passion. Adam Hampshire, who worked with us on it and is now based at Imperial, has followed up by using machine learning methods to analyze both brain and behavior during the performance of cognitive tasks. Came up with a paper in Nature Communications recently, and really building on the foundations of that earlier study, it does support the view that cognitive skills are more to do with shifting complex coalitions of brain networks, which change in response to what sort of task we're doing, rather than being dependent on one brain region focused on doing one job. Now, I've been at the Science Museum Group for a decade, and I've had lots of new opportunities to engage with audiences because we've got 5 museums: London, York, Bradford, Shildon, and Manchester, 5.5 million people. We don't talk about the public as such. We have 8 different audience types, and we think of all sorts of ways to reach those audiences. And maybe the first thing I did for the group was to work on a Hawking exhibition, and I've dealt with him personally since 1988, when he was on his brief History of Time tour, and saw him in UC Berkeley. One of the stranger things and more fun and more difficult things I had to do was organize an iPad portrait by David Hockney of Stephen Hawking. And Stephen came to the museum a few times. He used to visit as a child and was fond of the place. And it's rather fitting that this year we've actually acquired the contents of his office and his wheelchairs and his communications equipment and all sorts of mad memorabilia, which I hope will inspire future generations with his story and with his science. Now, we can engage with really big audiences too. Back in 2015, we celebrated Tim Peake's launch into space at the museum with 11,000 visitors, 4 cosmonauts, 2 live broadcasts with Stargazing Live, and so we had a big BBC audience as well. Among those astronauts was the great Alexei Leonov, the first spacewalker. And for me, the most epic moment was when we had 3,000 children count down to Tim Peake's Sawyers blasting off from Baikonur. As David Schuckman said, actually they were louder, I think, than the engines of the Sawyers. We've also celebrated the Webb's 30th with Tim Berners-Lee, who made a plea for global action to challenge its successes. And it's been fun putting together a lot of different events in the museum, from getting Tony Fauci to address an event on COVID vaccines, to bringing Bill Gates and Will.i.am, or as they jokingly said, Will.i.am and Bill.i.am, to talk about the future of technology. One slightly offbeat project, and this is the fun side of the job, was to challenge Alice Roberts to iron out the scars of human evolution for a new display. Alice had often opined in talks and in print about the hodgepodge of assembled parts that the human body is, and I'm sure a lot of people in the audience are aware of that. So she came up with a load of evolutionary solutions to some of the problems with the human body. So we had, she drew on the octopus anatomy for the eye, dogs for the plumbing of the heart, for greater redundancy, marsupial pouch to deal with those large-headed human babies, ostrich legs, and much more. And then she worked with this rather wonderful anatomical artist, Scott Eaton, with a sculptor as well, Sangeet Probkar, and came up with this rather unsettling image of what the perfect body looks like, which starred in a BBC4 program and went on display in the museum. In the last year, I've helped put together a series of climate talks, which have been seen by more than 20,000 people around the world. We've had 10 events so far, 4 to go. And it's been amazing. Actually, one of the upsides of COVID, if there is an upside, is it's really encouraged us to do online events where we've had people with 23-hour time differences in Kiribati, in Alaska, all over the place, contributing to this one set of talks. People like Brian Eno and Jane Goodall, James Lovelock, Kwasi Kwarteng, Partha Dasgupta, lots of amazing people. And then I've also been involved in COVID, not just for the AMS COVID committee or the MRC, of which I'm a member, and not just for a new exhibition that we're working on, a hunt for the vaccine that we hope to open at the end of next year. But I've also written about 1 or even 2 books worth of blogs about COVID-19, because we found there was a huge appetite for in-depth information. And just finally, talking of books, I've written or co-authored 8 top science books and edited 2 by the biotech entrepreneur Craig Venter. I had a couple of bestsellers, The Hour of Time and The Physics of Christmas. The latest one is The Dance of Life with Magda Zernicka-Gertz, talking about her remarkable work on growing embryos for longer than ever before, symmetry breaking and synthetic embryos, and also the remarkable story of her son, Simon. And I'm currently working on a book with Peter Coveney, who's the co-author of my bestseller, The Hour of Time. And we're looking at the global effort to simulate cells, organ systems, and even the whole body in the next generation of exascale computers. So I think that's it. Thank you to the Academy. Thank you so much. Thank you to my assistant, Katie. And thank you to Dr. Danny Rabiotti for providing advice on asking questions. So do fire away.